Hello and welcome to another top grade Mr. Salles video. Today we're looking at 12 quotes from A Christmas Carol. The last 3 are actually going to come from the ending because the ending is where the author always reveals their most important perspectives and it's the easiest way to get top grades. Coming in at number 1 is a quote that portrays Scrooge as a caricature, someone that is hyper-real, over-exaggerated. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. So this portrays him as a miser. It sets us up for the Christian symbolism of conversion. A grindstone is a deliberately antiquated image like a millstone, something that would have been used throughout history and biblical times. It's important because he is going to undergo a biblical kind of conversion. Jesus is going to change his life, not in the form of traditional Christian teaching, but in the form of the apparitions who appear, and Bob Marley who's going to appear and remind him of purgatory and hell. So it's going to help give us a Christian context to the novel. Scrooge is described in this long list of adjectives as squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous, and old sinner. Now, the whole idea of sin, of course, again, is Christian, so it sets us up for his conversion. And the over-exaggeration is clear in the rhythm of the sentence. You can do some language analysis there to show that it just carries us along with the joy of the description of this vile, evil figure. Of course, because there is a comedy to this, we don't truly believe that Scrooge is evil. Now that's important because we have to accept the conversion that happens to him, even though he's a sort of over-exaggerated character figure. Then we have this fantastic sibilance to go with as solitary as an oyster. He is sharp as steel. So we get the sense of evil from that sibilance. It mimics the sound of a snake, as you know. And Dickens is just having fun with this. He knows he's over-exaggerating and he wants the reader to know that he's over-exaggerating so that this won't be a tale that's too serious, but will be hugely enjoyable because it is a Christmas story. Yes, the Victorians loved the idea of a ghost story at Christmas. And this brings us to quotation number 2. There is a huge amount of comedy in the way that Marley appears with his face in the knocker and the reactions that Scrooge has where he tries to persuade Marley not to frighten him and not to give him any advice. But of course, Marley won't be deflected. We get the sense that Marley's ghost needs to educate Scrooge in order for Scrooge's conversion to lead to Marley being forgiven for his own sins and released from this purgatory where he has to wander the earth, clanking his chains invisibly. But the quotation we're going to zoom in on is not the comedy. It is, "I wear the chain I forged in life." And so there is the moral purpose where Dickens is saying, look, we are accountable for our actions. Exactly the same message as in An Inspector Calls. We are responsible to other people and we build the chain of our own damnation, our own time in hell or purgatory, according to our acts in life. There's the Christian message. I girded it of my own free will. Now that, of course, is super important because it is a Christian doctrine. The idea behind original sin is, look, God gave us free will in order to choose to be good, but original sin proves that we're much more likely to choose to be evil, and we have to overcome this. That is the message of the novel. We choose to look after ourselves and just acquire our own wealth and not worry about those outside our immediate family. In Scrooge's case, he doesn't even worry about his own family, does he? He only worries about himself. This is important because Dickens wants to show that no man is an island, no man is isolated, and therefore each person is responsible for helping others. This brings us to quotation number 3 and Fezziwig. Fezziwig is superbly important because he is an employer. Scrooge is an employer to Bob Cratchit. But all of Dickens' readers of this first edition of A Christmas Carol, which cost 5 shillings, would have been employers. 5 shillings is a third of Bob Cratchit's wages. More on that later. What that means is the book is priced at a level that is out of reach of the ordinary man. Dickens is writing this as a piece of propaganda. He genuinely wants to change people's views. He genuinely wants to change the views of the wealthy. He wrote this having been to factories seeing child labour, and he wanted to write a political pamphlet about how we should look after our young people and not let them go to work in really dangerous conditions. In fact, not send them to work at all. He wanted to write a book about education, but there was no money in that. And so he's taken those messages and put them into this extraordinary Christmas ghost story. It's very subtle, but it's going to be really important. Scrooge characterised Fezziwig like this: the happiness he gives is quite as great as it cost a fortune. So he deliberately links this happiness that Fezziwig gave to money because Scrooge is now starting to challenge his own views about the value of money. What's the point of having money if it doesn't buy happiness? So that conversion happens early on, and that is going to be Dickens' message to the rich. The true value of your wealth, he's going to say, is how you use it to benefit other people and society as a whole. That's going to happen right in your own household, because these wealthy readers would have employed cooks and maids and gardeners, live-in help who would have been in the house helping out for a very low wage. So each reader is an employer. Dickens wants to change the political view towards the poor as well. Who, though, is going to have political influence in this society in the 1840s? You guessed it, it's going to be the same wealthy readers. Quote number 4 looks at the value of education. The rates of literacy in Victorian London in particular went up astronomically. Lives were literally transformed by school. It's really difficult for us to understand now, where many students see no value in school. But in Victorian times, education was a passport to a completely and utterly different life. If you could read, you can write, you could transform your prospects. Now, Dickens is obsessed with that. Remember, that's the kind of book he wanted to write, but there was no money in it. So instead, he introduces the school experience of Scrooge. Yes, Scrooge is abandoned by his father and by society, alone at Christmas. But how does he spend his time? Well, we get given 2 books. One is Ali Baba, and it is set in Damascus. To a Christian, Damascus had a special value because St. Paul, who wrote part of the New Testament, had a conversion. He was not interested in Christianity, in fact was persecuting Christians, until on the road to Damascus he met the resurrected Christ. Jesus appeared to him. This is the conversion of St. Paul. Why is that so relevant? Well, obviously it links to the Christian message of the novel, but it also links the idea of conversion. It's telling his readers that everyone can convert themselves from one extreme view to another one that values everyone in society and tries to improve their lives. So that's the point of the Ali Baba story. The next story is Robinson Crusoe, the most famous person stranded on a desert island who learns to survive on his own, as solitary as an oyster like Scrooge, but then begins to value the companionship of his employee, Friday, which is an exact parallel with Scrooge's employee, Bob, but then escapes his isolation and returns to civilization. And what Dickens is suggesting is that this story, A Christmas Carol, is going to do the same for Scrooge. Not just through the teachings of the ghosts, but also symbolically what Dickens wants, the value of education to change the future for everyone. And we'll get back to that idea when we meet the ghosts, the figures of ignorance and want. But for our purposes, the value of education is key, and that's why we go back to Scrooge's schoolroom rather than other parts of his childhood. Next, the massive theme of fatherhood goes throughout the novel. The novel is actually going to end with an image of Scrooge as a father, but we're going back to the beginning when Scrooge was abandoned by his father. This is the origins of his fear. This is the origins of his desire for control, which is what his miserliness is, controlling his money, gathering more of it, but never spending it. It's all something he can hoard. So money becomes a metaphor, or if you like, the love of money is caused by the lack of love, and in particular, the lack of a father. So Scrooge has been abandoned by his father, whereas his sister becomes his father's favourite. And she comes and tells him, Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. Again, we obviously have the Christian message, heaven, but this is done ironically because we can infer that Scrooge never had this reconciliation with his father. His father isn't mentioned again, and Scrooge obviously becomes much more of a miser in his adult years than he is as a child. This is also important because it tries to explain psychologically why Scrooge would become so attached to this control of money and his relationships and not trusting other people to love him. We can link that to the fact that his sister dies, and we can link it to Belle, who claims that he loves the golden idol of money more than her. That's not going to be one of my 12 quotations, though it's too short, you can slip it in anywhere. Of course, he's also lost his mother. She's never mentioned, so she probably died really early on. And this parental abandonment helps explain Scrooge's psychological state. And it's why he has to learn to be a father to Tiny Tim later in the novel. Well, the quotation to link to Dickens' political purpose is, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. That is the easiest quote to fit any theme. This was famous as the view of the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who was dead, and in Dickens' time his views had been taken to mean it was pointless feeding the poor because they would always be poor and have more children, which would then spread poverty, and more people would consume more food, which would mean there was less to go around, and therefore more poor people would be created. And this, of course, led to extremely cruel social policy where poor people were sent to the workhouse, they weren't given benefits, and they weren't necessarily given much charity because the moral view was that poor people would be rich if they worked harder, or at least they'd be better off. Poor people were therefore seen as guilty of being lazy and just taking from people who deserved their wealth. Dickens wants to show that this is utterly nonsense, and he's going to point that out later on when all of Scrooge's possessions are stolen by people who have a job. The charwoman, the laundry woman, the undertaker's man. They are all employed, and Dickens' whole point is they still need to steal in order to survive, because those wealthy people, the readers of this novel, are not paying enough for services. Because this is such an important political message, the Ghost of Christmas Present repeats it back to Scrooge when Scrooge asks about Tiny Tim, saying, well, he'd better die and decrease the surplus population because Tiny Tim is disabled and therefore will not be able to do many of the physical jobs available to the poor. The other message is, without an education, Tiny Tim would not have had any role in this society. And then the third message is, because of his health, because of the attitude of people like Scrooge, and therefore the reader, Tiny Tim is going to die. This tugs at the reader's heartstrings. It's not just Scrooge who has to change his ways, it is us. So our next quote is obviously Tiny Tim, where Scrooge asks, "Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live." And obviously the future depends on Scrooge. And so at the minute, before Scrooge has had this Damascene conversion, remember St. Paul, Damascus, Tiny Tim is not going to be saved because Bob Cratchit is poor and his whole family is poor. And this brings us to Bob Cratchit. Scrooge says that he pays his clerk 15 shillings a week and a wife and a family he has to look after. And so he actually points out to these charity collectors that he pays Bob Cratchit so little, 15 shillings a week, that he can't adequately provide for his own family. Scrooge knows that, but he still doesn't pay him any more. Now, it's a mistake to think that's because he's a miser, because obviously if Scrooge is dramatically undercutting the market by paying Bob Cratchit too little, all Bob Cratchit has to do is get a job with another employer. But he doesn't. Why is that? Dickens is pointing something out here. He keeps coming back to how much he pays Bob Cratchit in specific amounts. What he's saying is this. This is the typical wage. Bob Cratchit is being paid what all workers of his level are paid. Scrooge isn't a miser in the wages he pays. No. The whole point is Scrooge is paying the going rate. All employers are misers. They're all paying at that level, and that is causing the poverty, and that is causing kids like Tiny Tim to die. That's the importance of us visiting the Cratchit family Christmas, to see them making do, making the best of the world with hardly anything. Because that is the society Dickens is saying we, the readers, allow, we, the readers, create. In 1848, revolution spread across European countries, and people were worried about revolution in England. This is the point of ignorance and want. These two children who have not only a physical poverty, but the poverty of the lack of education. That's why the boy is called Ignorance, and that's why he has doom written on his forehead. Dickens is saying, look, if we do not educate our children, they will not be able to better themselves. They will therefore be kept poor by society, and they will rebel against the rich. The rebellion will be violent. The rebellion will be revolution. And if we don't want that to happen, we've got to look after these young people, not just financially, but through education. Astonishingly, that is what happened in England. Schools spread everywhere. Every single large employer set up libraries for their employees so that they could learn to better themselves. This whole idea of education changing lives was part of Victorian DNA, and it started with people like Dickens campaigning for education for all children. Now we come to the last page of the novel, which is always rewarding in any text, and here is going to give us 3 quotes to fit every single essay that could possibly come up. We begin with this theme of fatherhood. And so what do we find out about Scrooge? That he did more, infinitely more, and to Tiny Tim, he became a second father. This is important because not only has Scrooge learned his lesson by looking after the individual, Tiny Tim represents all of these poor children, anyone who's disadvantaged in society. So he's conveying the message that all the readers should do that, but he's also psychologically explaining why Scrooge couldn't be a generous person because of his own upbringing, and how now becoming a father, he has fully replaced the void in his own life, his own father. And he's asking for this kind of transformation, Dickens is, from his readers. They should become like fathers to their employees and the people whom they pay. Then we have Scrooge the employer, who wishes Bob Cratchit a Merry Christmas and says, "I'll raise your salary." So this is really important. Charity is nowhere as important as wages. Dickens comes back to this idea. Charity might only happen at Christmas, but what if actually you raised everybody's wages every Christmas? That's something we have now with annual pay rises. Not so in Dickens' time, but Dickens is proposing that as a way to improve the lives of the poor. Again, the rich readers being asked to go into their pockets and reward their employees so that they don't have poor families. He hammers that home. It is to assist your struggling family. Then we come back to the theme of happiness, which is always also the theme of Christmas in this novel, and we get the narrator telling us what Scrooge became. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him. Notice how Dickens is looking at the psychology of the reader and thinking that they will feel ashamed of rejecting the views that they've had all their lives, that the poor deserve their poverty, to suddenly start helping the poor. They will be worried that their friends and family will start laughing at them for being an idiot. And so he makes sure that Scrooge doesn't care about people laughing about him in order to get away, in order to remove the reader's fears. So he let them laugh, and the result was that his own heart laughed. The psychological message is you will feel better if you give. That is in fact now something that we know from many studies. People who give gifts get much more happiness and pleasure than people who receive gifts. We actually get, as human beings, more pleasure from altruism, from helping others, than from being helped. So this is super important as a message to the readers. He's saying to them, look, you're actually going to have a better life by giving part of your money away. And that was quite enough for him. The message is, if this is enough for this caricature that I've introduced you to, this horrible miser at the grindstone, Scrooge, think how much better it will be for the lovely person that you are, dear reader. So let's bosh through those themes. You've seen that Scrooge has a fear of poverty, and Dickens has a much greater fear of the poverty in society and what that might lead to if people do not change their attitude to the poor. We've seen how the whole point of the story is that you achieve happiness through helping others. That leads us directly onto charity, and it also gave us the perspective that charity was not as important as paying a fair wage. All the fear of the ghost story is actually taken out by the introduction of comedy at the beginning. The true fear is what is going to happen to society if we don't change people's attitude to the poor. That will be an unconventional interpretation, if you get that question, that is bound to get you top grades. When we think about family here, the quotations are going to show that Scrooge's lack of a family, and in particular lack of a father, have led to his emotional coldness, which has led to his desire for control to replace that lack of love. And then the journey of the novel is experiencing that love again as a father figure, reinforcing the importance of family, which obviously you can then link to Fred and the Cratchits. Absolutely everything, of course, relates to Scrooge himself. We've had plenty of quotations that link to the Christian message. Now, you might be saying, Mr. Salles, you haven't really mentioned Christmas. Well, it's easy. All these 12 quotations that lead to all these lessons that Scrooge learns, they take place at Christmas, and they are revealed by these 3 ghosts of Christmas. And so just that introduction in your thesis statement, and then coming back at the end and saying how Scrooge celebrates in this way with wages and fatherhood and happiness at Christmas, will mean you're fully answering that question. Now, if you want to see the top grade 9 ideas in A Christmas Carol, this is the video to watch next.